Welcome, everyone. So glad that you all have joined us for the next installation of our coffee break webinar series, Demystifying Evaluation Planning for Grant Proposals. Hopefully you have a nice cup of coffee with you. Maybe it's a cold cup if the temperature is in your neck of the woods the way it is here. And hopefully also that you'll learn a lot as well from our conversation today. So before jumping into everything, do want to just reinforce that in our coffee break webinars, we really do encourage you to ask questions. So make sure that you use the question function on the computer. And we have with us Elise Hopes, who is our outreach coordinator who will help manage the Q&A portion of the webinar. And also, she's available if you're having any technical issues as well. So make sure to reach out to her. And then I'm Lana Rux, Principal Consultant with the Rux Group. And if you don't know, the Rux Group is a research and evaluation firm that gathers, analyzes, and interprets data to enable our clients to measure the impact of their work. We were formed in 2008, and over the past several years, we've had the privilege of working primarily with higher education institutions and grants funded by federal agencies such as the National Science Foundation, Department of Education, and Department of Labor, as well as philanthropic organizations as well. So in thinking about the topic for today, this is really motivated by our own internal self-reflection on our work on evaluation plans over the last year. So over the last year, we have worked with approximately 50 different project teams and writing about 47 project evaluation plans for grant proposals. And that translates roughly to about $90 million of grant funds sought. And so the other part of this in terms of our self-reflection is that we were really kind of curious in terms of what does this mean in terms of a win rate and the award rate and what the benchmark would be against that. So when we look specifically at new submissions and the win rate for grants that we know of so far that have been awarded, we know that our win rate is about 53%, and we're kind of proud of that because the benchmark, at least for grant writers in terms of the win rate, is around 30 to 40%. And in thinking about what got us there, we really think that a lot of it is in regards to that evaluation plan formula. So what we wanted to be able to do in this time together is one, just really be able to quickly do a review of the evaluation plan formula that we've introduced before, and then also provide some updates and lessons learned over the last year of working and utilizing the formula, as well as getting feedback from other individuals. And of course, really the whole purpose of these webinars is really to help to reduce the evaluation angst. So let's get started by looking at the evaluation plan formula review. So the evaluation plan formula is really based on three broad components. The first component is based on the foundations, and that's where you want to make sure that you're including elements that's related to the theory of change and evaluation questions. And the theory of change really relates to, if we do this, then we get that. And then evaluation questions relate to the idea of just how research is driven by questions, evaluation is driven by questions as well. The next two components are in regards to the methods, the evaluation design. How are you going to design? What's going to be the context for interpreting the findings? And then what data and analysis are you going to do to be able to provide evidence of the impact or outcomes of the initiative that you're working with? And then the final component is what we call the finale, which is around using the findings as well as the operational approach. Who will be using those findings? How will they be incorporated for continuous improvement purposes? And at the center of the formula is the theory that regardless of the type of evaluation that you're working on, whether if it's small, moderate, or large, you always want to have those elements included. The difference is that what the scale at which you're going to be writing. So for a small evaluation, for a small grant, the evaluation may have less words. For a moderate grant, you may have 1 to 2 pages to describe the evaluation section. And in that type of grant, you may also have an explicit requirement for an external evaluator. And then for a large grant, some of those same elements where you would have a requirement for an external evaluator, or even where you're required to name that evaluator. And then you may have between 2 to 4 pages to be able to write and describe the evaluation plan. So I went over the evaluation formula very quickly, but if you're not familiar with that evaluation formula, I would just encourage you to visit our YouTube page and go back and review each one of those those 30-minute webinars components. That goes much more in depth than what I'm able to right now. And another item that I would also encourage you to review too is that we also had in the fall a webinar on hiring the right evaluation partner. So if you're working on a moderate or large grant, you may want to review that for some tips on how to hire and work with an evaluator. So with that as context, one of the things that we've learned over the year is, can this formula actually work in a variety of different situations? And I think one of the things that we've learned is that the formula is quite robust, and that anecdotally that it does work in a variety of different situations. And let me try to demonstrate why I think that's the case. So I'm going to show you a series of different very pretty vases. Just look at the vase with the flowers, the empty vase, the blue vase, and the terracotta vase. A series of different vases. Now, I'm going to show you a picture. And very quickly, when you first look at that picture, did the vase stand out for you? Well, it may not have, because this is an ambiguous figure that's pretty common. But what it was essentially trying to do was to prime the idea of a vase. And very often, when you are primed or you see something of one type before you look at an ambiguous situation, that's what you actually will see in that picture. And I think in many ways, the formula does that in terms of helping you to be able to digest solicitations, requests for proposals that may be different or the ones that you don't normally work with. So let me give you an example of that. So we do a lot of work with, like I said, with NSF and DOE and DOL. But this last year, we worked a lot in a couple of different HRSA grants. And HRSA grants, in terms of how they're set up, if you're moving between federal agencies, each solicitation set up slightly differently. So in looking at this particular solicitation and reading it, there were a couple of things that stood out to me. So one, when reading the evaluation and technical support components, where the solicitation asked to describe the systems and processes that will support your organization's collection of HRSA's performance measurement requirements for this program, when I read that, what first came to mind was operational approach. Similarly, when asked about monitoring ongoing processes and progress toward meeting goals and objectives, that's also the same piece that came to mind too. When looking at including descriptions of inputs, and there's more here that just falls on a separate page, what came to mind was theory of change. And not to belabor a point, but just to show how the formula will map onto a solicitation. When reading describe data collection strategy to accurately collect, manage, analyze, and store and track data gathering and analysis came to mind for me. So in essence, the real point is that the formula, I think, is robust and is helpful in looking at different situations, because it will help you to see something that may be quote unquote ambiguous or unclear of how to approach it by having that formula as an organizing framework. So let me pause there and see if there are any questions. Elise, are there any questions from anyone?
Yes, our first question for the day is, does it matter what order those elements are presented in?
I don't think that, in looking at how individuals have approached it, I don't think that it really matters in terms of the order for most of the elements. You know, sometimes you may put operational approach first, sometimes it may go last. I do think the only piece I'm trying to think here real quickly that may make a difference is probably theory of change. If we do this, then we do that. That one you may want to be able to do earlier. But I think, and something that we'll get to later, is these differences of what's substantive and what's stylistic. I think in terms of just making sure that you have those elements included, that's substantive. That's the key important piece. I think how you do that, that gets to a much more stylistic issue. So hopefully that answers your question. Is there another question?
Those are all the questions at this moment.
Okay, fabulous. Let's go on and continue talking about some other updates and lessons learned. So one question that has come up or that we've learned over the last year is in regards to, is there anything that you really should keep in mind from a practical standpoint? And I would say yes, and it's around spacing issues. So if you have worked in grants, you know that space requirement's very important. We were just finishing up a grant this week, trying to take it from 21 pages down to 15 pages. So you know spacing's really important. And so one of the things that really has become illuminating to me over the last year is when I think about the different sizes of a grant, from small, moderate to large, and thinking about the way that you approach the evaluation plan by kind of pulling in elements or kind of pushing in elements. One piece that I've learned is that that you may not necessarily get 3 or 4 pages for a large grant. And so you have this larger grant that has a lot of complexity, but you don't necessarily have the space to be able to handle that in a traditional way. So I had to make some adjustments, and I'll share what I mean in those adjustments. So I think that when dealing with spacing issues, that the areas of the evaluation plan that get most impacted are usually around the evaluation questions and the data matrix. And again, just let me demonstrate and show what I mean by that. So at the heart of this formula, again, is pulling in and pulling out different elements. So when you have, for instance, a moderate scale type grant, you're going to pull out in terms of the number of evaluation questions that you have. And so for a moderate scale, you may have 5 questions, and then you create a data matrix associated with that. So that's very manageable within a 2-page limitation, right? But when you start thinking about a larger grant that has a lot more complexity to it, it's very possible that you would end up with 20 questions or more questions. And actually, both of these, just so that you have, if you haven't seen the other webinars, both of these examples actually come from the webinar from last year. So really kind of dovetails into what we talked about last year if you go back and look at those webinars. And so for the large scale grant, you may have a lot more questions. And for these purposes, I won't have all 20 questions that are there. And so one of the ways that I approached this year was in thinking about what types of evaluation questions I would have liked to have asked, and then creating more overarching themes. So if you look at these questions, these list of 10 questions, there's some themes that emerge. So if you look at the first 3, the theme that emerged is really in regards to the number of participants. If you look at the next three questions, the theme that emerges is in regards to student success. The next three relate to employment, and the final one relates to wages. And so one of the ways that you can handle when you don't necessarily have a lot of space is by looking at what the themes are and then creating overarching themes. Um, Creating overarching themes and the when you're writing out your evaluation questions and creating the data matrix, and that will help you to be able to save some space. And then you can also note in the operational component that you're going to fully distill out the evaluation when you get started, when the project is funded, so that then you can have that opportunity and let the reviewers know that again those aren't all the questions that you're going to address, but that you're just trying to approach it by theme. Something else in terms of, I think, just in thinking about practical considerations is saving space in developing the logic model. And the logic model, actually, let me say this first. So in thinking about the logic model, we usually develop that from left to right. And so instead of writing it from the traditional left to right framework, write it from top to bottom. So again, here's a logic model, which is basically like a detailed theory of change. And then this kind of template, you see that it's written from that traditional left to right standpoint. So I was relatively recently working on an evaluation plan and trying to develop the logic model. Now, the one I'm about to present isn't the one that I was actually working on. This is kind of a hybrid of several different projects. But as I was working on it, I could very easily get the inputs listed. And then I started trying to go through and write out the activities. And as it was a slightly complex project, and I kept writing the activities and realized I was running out of space and realized that perhaps this isn't going to be the most effective organization for being able to have the communication with the project team. So it's actually in working with a grant writer that I saw when she was developing the evaluation. She actually just went in a Word document from top to bottom and would write up the logic, say this is a logic model, have the inputs, which again, just in this situation, I'm not having it listed there so that I can show you what this looks like, but then listed out the activities. And as you can see, you can get all the activities listed on one page, which is a bit easier to be able to do it this way than if you are actually having to do it from the left to right framework. So it's just something to be able to help in terms of the development phase. And then if you actually do have to submit the logic model in the grant, you can then identify out different themes, and then that will help to condense out the logic model for the proposal as well. So kind of a space saver for development and also a potential space saver for the actual proposal as well. So let me pause there for a moment. Elise, are there any additional questions at this point?
We do have a couple of questions. The first is, do you also cut back on the number of data points and data indicators because there are less questions?
No, that's a really good question. Even though there are less questions, because you are writing the questions at this overarching level, theoretically, those data points should still apply within that question and apply to that question, because it's still going to link back to certain goals and objectives to the proposal. And so I don't necessarily cut back on the data points are and the data indicators. The only time that I may be trying to condense things out as if I'm still kind of pressed with some spacing issues, and I may try to come up with some additional kind of creative overarching terms, but conceptually, I'm not dropping out or eliminating any types of data points. So hopefully that insight's helpful.
Thank you. There is another question.
Okay.
It is, I could see how other areas of the evaluation plan could be impacted by spacing issues. Do you see any other issues as well?
I do. I think that, again, that the evaluation questions and the data matrix are probably the two components that are most impacted. Just because, again, if you're kind of trying to pull out the amount of detail, the detail is going to come in the evaluation questions. And so then if you're developing the data matrix to support that, then that's going to be larger too. So I do think that that's definitely a place where it could be the primary place that it would be impacted. I also do think the theory of change can be impacted as well. So if you go back and look at the webinar, one of the things that I suggest doing is if you have, in trying to develop the theory of change, you create a sentence that says if then. And I said too that it can be a kind of a lengthier sentence, but still try to get a sentence or still find a way to summarize that project within that if-then framework. I do think that if you have a very complicated project with a lot of moving parts, that if-then simple sentence can be challenging. What I did do in a couple of situations this past year in terms of handling that, I did the if, but then instead of trying to create a sentence, I did sacrifice some space and made some bullet points that if we do this, then we would get A, and explained A, B, and C, because it was just a bit too complicated to try to get into all of one sentence. So yes, I think I am in agreement with you that there are probably other areas that can be impacted as well. So let me just go ahead and go on here real quickly, and we'll return back to some additional questions. So the other item that I think we learned or had insights on, or at least questions surrounding it, is just in regards to what advice would you give for handling resubmissions? And I would say definitely resubmit. I think that's a really important piece to be able to get some feedback and to resubmit your proposal. I do think there are a couple of things to keep in mind when you resubmit. One is just in regards to the reviewer's feedback. And I mentioned this earlier, and I think that when looking at feedback, there's what I conceptually think of as substantive and what I conceptually think of as stylistic. And this is just the gospel according to Lana. And I think of this not, it's kind of tricky because if you frame it in this way, it's almost as though you're saying that one's important and one is not important. And that's not really for me the take home message, at least for my role line projects. Partly what I'm trying to glean from feedback is what needs to be done for that particular project. But I'm also trying to understand what are the larger take home messages that I need to take and apply to other grants and other projects that we're working on. So substantive issues for me are things that are really at the meat. So if I took the example that I provided before in regards to making sure that you have the data matrix, or making sure that you have the evaluation questions, operational approach. To me, those are really kind of those substantive issues. And then those stylistic is how do you put those together? What's the organization associated with that? And then also in regards to something else that I look at is, I know I've had situations in which, this is one in particular a couple of years ago, in which received feedback that X, Y, and Z wasn't included in, and I'm like, I thought I was included in, and so making sure that I have like headers and literally changing the style so that it's understood and that we know that it's included within that evaluation plan. The other piece, just real quickly, because we're getting close to time, is that you want to make sure that if you are looking at the reviewers and comment, that you're also looking at the solicitation. And this particularly is important if you have been working with some NSF grants this year. A number of solicitations have changed. One is with the ESTIM grant, and there was solicitation that changed. The solicitation changed around the requirements for the which tracks that the generation of knowledge research activities were required. So you want to also just make sure that the reviewer's feedback is still relevant for what is required of the current solicitation as well. So let me just pause there real quickly to see if there are any other questions.
We do have one final question. Are there any interesting trends emerging that you've seen?
Oh, that's a good question. The one trend over the last year that I've seen that just struck me, that surprised me just a little bit, and I suppose it shouldn't, is the extent to which industry partners and partnerships have emerged as being important. So a lot of our initial work that we've the space that we worked with was within NSF, ATE, community, technician education. And I think for years, there was this understanding that industry partnerships and industry involvement was very critical to the work of ATE projects. I think in this last year, what was very interesting to me was to start really seeing that within undergraduate and graduate level education, an emerging emphasis on industry partnerships, particularly within STEM and graduate education around STEM, and the attempt to transform graduate education with the realization that more individuals may go into industry versus the academy. And so that's been reflected slightly, I think, within that greater emphasis and weight to industry involvement. So I think that's been a real interesting trend that I've observed. So thanks for asking that question. If there are other questions, we can hold those, and I will try to make sure to follow up with you individually, but we do just have a couple of minutes left, so let me just go over a couple of points real quickly. So one, we stay tuned for our next webinar, which will be in September of this fall. We're really excited on being able to bring a couple of guest speakers in for this webinar. And then also, just as a final point and a final thought, is that in thinking about some of these ideas, and again, these are just my perspectives and kind of based on my own experience, is that I really don't see that there's real broad and large differences in terms of awarded and non-awarded projects. They're usually just relatively small items. And that I think in terms of using some of these items in terms of lessons learned, as well as using the evaluation formula, I think those are some of those things that will help to just address some of those small items to help to make sure that you increase the chance of your project actually being awarded. So with that, it's been a really fast 30 minutes this afternoon, but thank you ever so much for joining us. If there's any outstanding questions that you haven't asked, please don't hesitate to reach out and we'll make sure to answer them. So thank you and have a great rest of the day.